Subject Linguistics, course title Pragmatics and Discourse Analysis, Module 18, Ethnography of Communication. You will readily agree that in our everyday life, it is perhaps more important to understand how language is used to do certain things rather than the description and analysis of its syntax, semantics, phonology, or morphology. This idea forms the subject matter of an approach in anthropological linguistics known as ethnography of communication. Ethnography deals with the description and analysis of the speech patterns and language of ethnic groups. This approach finds its origin in the works of Del Hymes and John Gompers in the early 1960s. Hymes rejected abstract analysis of language and grammar and emphasized the analysis of language in social settings, thus helping in describing the rituals, traditions, behaviors, and speech of tribal and non-tribal communities. Hymes was against the Chomskyan paradigm, especially Chomsky's idea of a homogeneous environment where speaker and hearer communicate without any distractions. In contrast, Hymes spoke of doing research in everyday social surroundings and analyzing whether the language of participants was appropriate to context, known as communicative competence. For example, we talk differently at a party and at a condolence meeting. We are expected to be sober at the latter and jovial at the party. Thus, ethnography examines the speech patterns of individuals in their ethnic settings in interaction with other members of society. The ethnographic model assumes further importance for second language speakers like English for us, precisely because it tells us that we not only need general linguistic knowledge but social and cultural knowledge that governs what we say, to whom, and why. This means that norms of speaking vary across cultures. For example, in the American culture, people address their superiors by their first names, but this practice is relatively less prevalent in the Indian context. Similarly, we find that Arabs engage in greater interpersonal contact as compared to Americans and Japanese. We will now discuss some of the fundamental concepts in ethnography, namely speech community, speech event, and speech acts, before describing the model propounded by Hymes in 1986. Hymes states that speech community is a difficult notion to define, but it's important because it postulates the unit of description as a social rather than a linguistic entity. Hymes further explains that a speech community in the ethnographic sense may be defined as a community sharing rules for the conduct and interpretation of speech and rules for the interpretation of at least one linguistic variety. Both conditions are necessary. One cannot claim to be a member of a speech community simply by sharing grammatical rules from a language variety. Hymes said that one could grammatically identify someone's language but not understand the message because one may not be aware of how or what a request answer question is in that language, or what is the role of irony, silence, emphasis in a language. This means that the content and the way it is presented might be unknown to the speaker. Thus, to the extent that speakers share knowledge of the communicative constraints and options in a particular social context, they were said to be members of the same speech community. This means that the members need not speak the same language all the time, but they need to share at least one language so that social meanings could be decoded and communication could be successful. Figueroa 1994 and Scher 2006 are of the view that the notion of speech community can be viewed from three perspectives: structural linguistics, sociology of language and ethnography of communication, and Lebovian sociolinguistics. A speech community in the first sense means the existence of a single language. In the second sense, it means a speech community where people are united by symbolic integration, creating a dense network of communication. According to Himes, the existence of at least one shared linguistic system is a necessary but not a sufficient condition. In the third sense, being a part of a speech community means sharing same attitudes and values towards a language. It is clear by now that speech communities are constituted not just by a shared variety of language, but shared sets of norms and conventions of language use. For instance, a second language speaker of English, like we are, together with the native speaker of English, would form a speech community only if we also share norms, socially accepted and culturally appropriate linguistic behavior of language use. A person can belong to more than one speech community depending on his linguistic repertoires, socialization patterns, and social roles. Other essentials in the ethnographic framework are the notions of speech situation, speech event, and speech act. These are hierarchical units where a speech act is part of a speech event and the event is part of a speech situation. The example that Himes gives is of a party that includes a dinner and one of the guests cracks a joke. Here the party is a speech situation and the dinner is the speech event and the joke is the speech act. A speech situation can include many speech events and the latter consists of several speech acts. The three concepts are thus interrelated. Moreover, an understanding of these concepts is a prerequisite for an ethnographic analysis based on Himes' 16-point model. Ceremonies, fights, hunts, meals, lovemaking, and the like are some of the situations given by Himes. According to Himes, a hunt, for example, may comprise both verbal and non-verbal events, and the verbal events may be more than one type. We will now discuss the notion of a speech event. Speech event is the fundamental unit of analysis in a speech community. Any form of speech that is determined by norms of behavior can be considered a speech event. Examples include giving and taking interviews, buying and selling goods in a shop, courtroom scenes with the lawyers arguing the case and questioning witnesses, religious sermons, and everyday conversations, etc. Himes explained that a speech event could consist of a single or many speech acts. In a religious rite, a prayer is a single act, but it can include other acts as singing, hymns, chanting, etc. It may be noted that the same type of speech act may recur in different types of speech event and the same type of speech event in different contexts of situation. Thus, according to Himes, a joke, which is a speech act, may be found in a private conversation, a lecture, a formal introduction. Similarly, a lecture may be part of a seminar by a professor or a part of dinner time talk by the father to the son. We will now discuss the concept of a speech act. The speech act is the smallest unit of the three. A speech act is that language unit through which some social action is performed. Himes is of the view that the speech act is a minimal unit but is different from a sentence. It can be both verbal and non-verbal. It is important to note that although speech act may seem similar to speech act in the sense of Austin's as an action, a reply, a request, a question, a command, etc., but it is more likely that Himes used it in a broader sense as a joke, greeting, etc. Gumpers says that At this level, decisions are made about the more immediate discourse talks such as narrating, describing, requesting, which make up everyday activities. We'll now speak about communicative competence. The notion of communicative competence is central to ethnography. Communicative competence means language use appropriately to a particular context. These are rules for the production and interpretation of speech, not just knowledge of grammatical rules of a language, and it is this that determines our performance as social speakers in a social context. Troike is of the view that it includes both knowledge and expectation of who may or may not speak in social settings. The notion of communicative competence challenged Chomsky's notion of linguistic competence, known as knowledge of grammatical rules, because Himes refused to accept Chomsky's idea of an ideal speaker-hearer community where perfect communication took place without any problems. On the contrary, Himes said that communication was governed by the degree of acceptability, grammaticality, feasibility, and possibility in a social context. We will now discuss Himes' framework captured by the mnemonic speaking. Ethnography of a communicative event is a description of all the components that are relevant in understanding how that particular communicative event works. It also provides a framework for comparing different speaking practices across communities. Himes identified 16 components, the first one of which is setting and scene. Setting, that is S, refers to the time and place, that is the concrete physical circumstances in which speech takes place. For instance, your class of sociolinguistics, time 10 to 11 a.m. in the classroom in the Department of Linguistics, the teacher and the board on which she writes, etc., is one example of a setting. Another example is of a marriage party with its tent, tables, chairs, and the main stage for the bride and groom, and an area for dancing. Scene, on the contrary, Himes says, refers to the abstract psychological setting or the cultural definition of the occasion. For instance, the scenes in a novel or short story may change from the childhood portrayal of the hero to his youth or his years of involvement in a social struggle. It may even change from one page to the other. In a particular setting, of course, participants are free to change scenes as they change the level of formality. Your teacher might be serious while explaining the theoretical basis of the ethnography of communication, but might get angry if the students are not serious, or she might evoke laughter by cracking a joke if it is necessary to change the mood of the class. Change in the kind of activity also brings a change in the scene. For instance, the teacher might shift from lecturing to explaining how to tackle a potential question in the examinations. Setting can remain fairly constant, but scenes can change quickly as seen in a movie or song. Setting is also easier to identify, while scene requires analysis. We will now talk about the participant framework, P, the second component in the model. Instead of the classical speaker-hearer dyad, Himes discusses many participant roles such as source destination, sender receiver, addresser addressee, etc. One person can perform a single or many roles. Alternatively, a group can together perform one role. In a drama where two characters are talking, the audience as a whole is the addressee, but the characters themselves perform many roles: speakers, hearers, addressers, and addressee. In a church service, The priest cannot be called the speaker proper because he is not the source of the utterance as he is speaking the words of God. A prayer obviously assigns one role each for the God or the deity, the priest and the audience. We will now talk about ends denoted by the alphabet E. It refers to the conventionally recognized and expected outcomes of an exchange and the personal goals that participants seek to accomplish on particular occasions. Outcomes are public while goals are personal and the two often clash. There is perhaps always a tug of war between the socio-culturally expected outcomes and the outcomes that you desire by becoming a participant in a particular speech event or speech act. A person might give a speech on sexist language use in an event with a particular goal in mind, expecting to be appreciated, but the public might reject it if it offends their sensibilities. Emphasizing this demarcation between outcomes and goals, Himes says that the purpose of an event from the community's standpoints may differ from those of the participants, as in the event of litigation where both parties desire to win. You must have observed that in politics and in business negotiations, participants might have different ends in mind. We will now talk about the next element, act sequence, is denoted by the alphabet A. Act sequence refers to the precise words used and how they are used to express a particular topic at hand. The former is labeled as the message form and the latter as message content. No speech can take place without a form, and it is this necessity that makes it fundamental. Think of a speech like greeting, for example. You could say a hello or a good morning, but you can also wave, nod, bow, or just smile, and still you will not be accused of being rude. In both instances, you have used a definite message form, in one instance verbal and in the other non-verbal, to carry out the act of greeting. Many serious errors occur, according to Himes, when there is a mismatch between form and content, and this is because we ignore the fact that how something is said is part of what is said. It is this mismatch which is significant for analysis. For example, one might threaten someone politely in a soft voice or joke with a deadpan or serious expression. The distinction between message form and message content would be instantly clear with the following example. He prayed, saying, within quotes, quoting message form, versus he prayed that he would get well, that is reporting content only. Content is closely related to the topic, and a shift in the topic suggests a change in the content. Message form and message content are integral to speech act and are interrelated, therefore they are called as act sequence, that is A. We will now learn about key, that is known by the letter K. Key refers to the tone, manner, or spirit in which a particular message is conveyed. Sometimes you may be serious, light-hearted, or sarcastic. Your message may be serious, but you might say it jokingly, seriously, or smilingly with a wink. Thus, the key may be a part of the analysis, non-verbally, by your behavior, gesture, posture, or even kind of clothes you wear. There is an inconsistency between the content and the key that the person is using. It is the key rather than the actual content that takes precedence. Parodies are good examples of how participants exploit key over message content. It is this aspect that Himes emphasizes when he says, when there is a conflict with the overt content of an act, key often overrides the letter, as in sarcasm. We will now discuss the next component in Himes' model called instrumentalities, denoted by the alphabet. It refers to the choice of channel used in communication. It can be oral, written, telegraphic, semaphore, etc. It also refers to the actual forms of speech that are chosen, such as the language, dialect, code, or register. Formal, written, legal language is one kind of instrumentality. A further distinction that can be made is the mode of communication employed within a particular channel. For example, singing, humming, whistling, or chanting all fall under oral channel. Himes reports that in a tribal community in Venezuela, the Ojo chant is used for trade and social purposes. Norms of interaction refers to the specific behaviors and properties that attach to speaking, that one must not interrupt, for example, or that one may freely do so, that normal voice should not be used except when scheduled in a church service, whisper otherwise, that turns in speaking are to be allocated in a certain way. You must have observed these norms of interaction while, say, paying a visit to a place of worship, attending an academic event, an exhibition, theater, or a political gathering. Norms of interpretation refer to how the norms of interaction may be viewed by someone who does not share them. Any violation of norms of interpretation may lead to misunderstanding or a complete breakdown in communication. Consider, for instance, a famous example of different norms of interpreting the nodding of your head up and down. For people in North India, this non-verbal speech act shows affirmation, agreement, and understanding of the message, but for people from the South, it is a marker of negation or disagreement. The Nasi notes that a tap on the side of the head can be interpreted different in different cultures. It can mean stupidity or intelligence. Similar is the case for yes-no gestures or for other forms of non-verbal communication such as interpersonal distance, laughter, and silence. For example, silence is highly valued among the Japanese. We will now learn about the last component in the ethnographic model, namely genres, that is denoted by the letter G. Genres refer to clearly demarcated types of utterances that depend on the kind of speech event one is engaged in. Your teacher may deliver a lecture on theory by employing the language of prose. Similarly, singing among the women folk using a particular local dialect can come under the genre of folk singing. The language used in church service can be another example. Proverbs, riddles, prayers, lectures, and editorials each represent distinct genres fit for particular occasions. Though genre analysis is a distinctive subfield in discourse analysis, yet it is an important component for understanding the verbal patterns of a community at the individual and group levels. In this unit, we've learnt about ethnography, its salient concepts, and how the native speaker actually achieves the objective of communication through the use of language. Thank you.